Now, the American President Donald Trump has reiterated his threat of targeting the BRICS grouping as he raises alarm of what he terms as anti-America policies. The warning underscores how geopolitical alignments are increasingly driving economic fractures. So let's compare the two blocs that are shaping the storm. Now, the heart of the U.S. economic policies and groupings is the G7, and this includes the 7 wealthiest nations in the world. There are the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and Canada. They remain the bedrock of the post-World War II financial governance. Now, despite slow growth and an aging demographics, the G7 still contributes a staggering 44% of the global GDP in nominal absolute dollar terms. Its influence is anchored in capital markets, innovation ecosystems, and regulatory clout. But the bloc's economic momentum is flagging, with most members growing below 2% annually and grappling with inflation, trade deficits, and also a political gridlock. Now, the BRICS, which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is leveraging demographic heft and policy independence to redefine multipolarity. India is now poised to outpace all G7 economies in terms of growth. The bloc accounts for about 40% of the global population and almost 35% of the GDP in terms of purchasing power parity. Their agenda is more than symbolic. Recent meetings witnessed some unified calls for peace in West Asia, de-dollarization, and also a cross-border BRICS payments platform. Now, Trump's trade policies, while aimed at realigning loyalty, risks alienating the rising economies who already feel excluded from legacy systems. Now, the G7 may still control the levers, but the BRICS is increasingly rewriting the narrative as the global economy is entering into a new era of fragmentation. The question, of course, is no longer about which bloc is bigger, but which one is shaping the future. All right, now joining us in the broadcast, we've got Mr. Edwin Naidu, who's a political commentator. He's joining us all the way from Johannesburg in South Africa. Mr. Naidu, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. Now, there are many comments which Donald Trump has been making about BRICS. He's called it a little group that is fading away fast, which is clearly not the reality. Why do you think Donald Trump is so concerned about the rise of the BRICS?
Well, I think Donald Trump, fears being outsmarted and outshone by the combined might of the BRICS countries. And I think, he fears that the end of the unpolar world where America and Europe ruled the world through the barrel of a gun and starved masses by demanding, for example, loan repayments in dollars. I think he fears that the rest of the world has woken up to the fact that the West, led primarily by white male supremacists, does not add value to the so-called third world countries such as the African countries, Latin America, Middle Eastern countries, Asian nations as well. And, if you really look at it, and Donald Trump is being like a dictator. We've seen that attitude escalate increasingly. And, many feel that the West has brought nothing but terror and fear to many countries. I can list many, including Libya in Africa, by sponsoring terror or regime change, but, bringing nothing but instability to the region. Right. So Trump fears that new players like China, Brazil, India, and Africa will no longer pander to the whims of the West and, will rely on each other when it comes to consumer goods and services, including manufacturing of products.
Right. Now, the BRICS itself is very interesting. It is not an alliance. It is just a grouping of these nations which have got very, in many ways, competing and disparate interests. With that being the case, do you not think Donald Trump would do well to try and accommodate some of the BRICS nations rather than try and alienate them in the manner that he's been doing by imposing tariffs on the BRICS nations?
Well, certainly, BRICS came together as nations, as big developing nations, with the intention of harnessing each other's for the betterment of each other in whether it's education, economy, social services or welfare, whatever. And I think, when you look at what Trump is trying to do is use presidential clout. For example, Apple, was recently hit with a 25% tariff for wanting to move its manufacturing plants to India. And of course, we've seen Apple had to backtrack and put investments back into the American economy. And I think what you're looking at is bullying of the BRICS nations, because potentially you also have, if you consider, the BRICS countries have numbers, vast numbers, because of Africa in particular. The youthful population is large. They have growing economies compared to the aging population of the West and European countries in particular. So I would say you're absolutely right. They should be looking at working together, harnessing the best of each other to ensure that there's parity. But I think the alienation and, the bullying and saying if you deal with BRICS countries, we're going to impose tariffs, it's actually not productive and does not help because,
Indeed.
Prior to Donald Trump coming into power, the American government actually worked very well with African, Indian, Asian countries from a developmental perspective. And we've seen that shift in policy is actually affecting these nations in a variety of ways. If you take funding, for example, we've seen funding cuts to NGOs, for example, resulting in a number of organizations being closed and people being put out of jobs, for example.
So I think you've made a number of significant points there. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Naidu, for joining us with that perspective there.
Sure.